April 10, 2024. The air in Brussels, Belgium, was thick with geopolitical tension, mirroring the high stakes inside the closed-door conference room where the G7 finance ministers and central bank governors convened. This was not a routine fiscal discussion, it was an extraordinary session dedicated entirely to a singular, explosive problem, the fate of Russia's vast, yet inaccessible, financial reserves. Since February 2022, the West had effectively quarantined an astonishing $300 billion in Russian central bank assets, a monumental financial blockade. Crucially, these funds were frozen, meaning immobilized, not confiscated outright. They lay dormant in secure custody accounts, predominantly held at Euroclear in Belgium, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and the Bank of England. Russia could not access a single penny, but neither had the West yet dared to seize the principal. For 2 long years, this frozen wealth served as a formidable diplomatic lever, ceased the conflict in Ukraine, and eventually, the funds might be unfrozen. But by April 2024, the calculus had dramatically shifted. The war was grinding into its 3rd brutal year. Kyiv faced critical funding shortfalls, while the vital pipeline of US congressional aid remained frustratingly stalled by domestic political gridlock. The original leverage strategy had reached its expiration date. A decisive, unprecedented action was required. Inside that insulated conference room, the ministers ratified a controversial compromise. The G7 would stop short of seizing the principal $300 billion but would immediately confiscate the substantial interest generated by these assets, a sum estimated at a robust $3 billion annually. That interest income would then be systematically transferred to Ukraine for reconstruction and wartime expenses. The announcement, delivered on April 30, 2024, was immediately hailed by Western media as a brilliant stroke of financial justice, a mechanism to make Russia's frozen assets contribute directly to Ukraine's reconstruction. It was elegant, creative, and politically palatable, punishment delivered without the full legal and market upheaval of outright confiscation. But in the central bank headquarters of geopolitical powers across the globe in Beijing, Riyadh, New Delhi, Abu Dhabi, and Brasilia, a profoundly different, and terrifying, discussion unfolded. The essential question posed by ministers to their staff was chillingly uniform: if they can unilaterally execute this maneuver against Russia, what prevents them from doing the exact same to us? The answer, self-evident and alarming, was yes. If the West could weaponize the freezing of $300 billion for geopolitical ends and subsequently transfer the accrued income to fund a war against the asset's owner, then the sovereign reserves of any nation, held conventionally in US dollars, euros, or British pounds, were fundamentally exposed. A nation's sovereign wealth, it became clear, was only sovereign until it ceased to be convenient for the issuer. Thus began the quiet, systematic, and massive retreat. Without fanfare, press releases, or official warnings, central banks worldwide commenced a coordinated strategic divestment from US Treasury bonds on a scale not witnessed in half a century. The selling was not a panic dump that would crash the market, but a steady, disciplined withdrawal, executed month after month. By December 2024, just 8 months following the G7's consequential decision, the total foreign holdings of US Treasuries had plummeted by a staggering $400 billion. China alone shed $89 billion, Japan, a critical ally, offloaded $95 billion, and Saudi Arabia liquidated $32 billion. This was not typical opportunistic profit-taking, it was a calibrated, strategic global move away from the bedrock of the US financial system, triggered explicitly by the decision to seize Russian income. And this dramatic financial exodus has only just begun. Here is the complete history detailing the specific mechanism by which the seizure of Russia's $300 billion triggered a global flight from treasuries. We will examine the undeniable data proving this trend is happening in real time, identify which countries are selling, what alternatives they are buying instead, who is absorbing this immense selling pressure, and, most critically, what happens when the only remaining buyer is the Federal Reserve, the technical definition of a failed treasury market. The central narrative here is not merely about Russia. Russia lost $300 billion in potential income. The true, profound damage was inflicted upon the United States. By weaponizing the treasury market, the US inadvertently destroyed the very foundation of its global supremacy, the extraordinary capacity to borrow nearly unlimited amounts of capital at privileged, low interest rates, sustained by the world's absolute confidence in US debt. That foundation of trust is gone, and once trust is gone in financial markets, restoring it is nearly impossible. Before February 2022, the US Treasury market was universally acknowledged as the deepest, most liquid, and most trusted financial market in the world. Total US government debt held by the public stood at $24 trillion. Foreign central banks and investors held approximately $7.6 trillion of that debt, roughly 30%. China held $1 trillion. Japan held $1.3 trillion. This ecosystem was deemed normal and had been stable for decades. Foreign nations accumulated massive dollar reserves through persistent trade surpluses and needed an unimpeachable, safe haven to store this wealth. US Treasuries were the obvious, unassailable choice, safe, perfectly liquid, and backed by the full faith and credit of the United States. More than that, Treasuries were understood to be above politics. Yes, the US had previously frozen the assets of acknowledged enemy nations, Cuba, Iran after 1979, North Korea, Libya, and Venezuela. These were small economies, often labeled rogue states, operating outside international norms. The implicit rule was clear: if you maintain normal diplomatic and commercial relations, your treasury holdings were sacrosanct. This implicit guarantee was the essential foundation of dollar dominance and the exorbitant privilege. It allowed the US to run perpetual, astronomical budget deficits because the rest of the world could always be relied upon to purchase the resulting debt. The moment of rupture arrived swiftly. On February 24, 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine. Within 72 hours, the West announced the immediate freezing of Russian central bank reserves. The total amount immobilized was $300 billion, distributed roughly as $100 billion in Euroclear, $100 billion at the New York Fed, $50 billion at the Bank of England, and $50 billion in other European central banks. This action was unprecedented, not because asset freezes were new, but because Russia was fundamentally different from North Korea or Iran. Russia was the 11th largest economy, a major energy exporter, and a permanent member of the UN Security Council. Russia held $600 billion in total reserves, of which they had specifically diversified $300 billion into Western currencies as an insurance policy against sanctions. They diversified into Western reserves believing those assets were shielded by the global financial architecture. They were profoundly mistaken. Every other central bank observed this seismic event with deep unease. The immediate international reaction was publicly muted but intensely fraught in private. Central bank governors convened emergency, unscheduled meetings. The question dominating every discussion was deceptively simple yet terrifyingly complex: how much of our nation's reserves are suddenly vulnerable? For China, the answer was horrifying. China controlled $3.4 trillion in foreign exchange reserves, holding approximately $1 trillion in US Treasuries and another $500 billion in various dollar assets over $1.5 trillion potentially susceptible to freezing should relations with the US deteriorate over, say, Taiwan. For Saudi Arabia, the vulnerability was $120 billion in treasuries, for the UAE, $40 billion, for Taiwan, $240 billion, for South Korea, $170 billion. Every country with substantial dollar reserves abruptly realized those reserves were not a secure store of value, but rather a colossal financial hostage held by US foreign policy. If the US could freeze Russia's $300 billion for invading Ukraine, they could freeze anyone's reserves for any reason Washington deemed politically sufficient. The reserves were no longer a safe haven, they were leverage. Yet, the initial freeze alone was insufficient to trigger a mass sell-off. Central banks are deliberate and move slowly. They held on to a fragile hope that the freeze was an extreme, temporary measure, tied specifically to the Ukraine conflict, and that once the war concluded, normal rules of financial conduct would resume. That hope died irrevocably on April 30, 2024. The G7 announcement that Russian frozen assets would be actively used, that the interest generated would be transferred to Russia's enemy, Ukraine, crossed a monumental line. This was no longer freezing pending resolution, this was functional confiscation and redirection of income. The legal justification was creative: the interest income is separate from the principal. Russia technically still owns the $300 billion. The West is merely taking the profits. However, from a central bank perspective, this distinction was utterly meaningless. If you own an income-generating asset and someone else permanently claims the income it generates, you do not functionally own that asset anymore. This action served as an undeniable, global signal that Treasury holdings were now vulnerable to political confiscation, and the selling accelerated immediately. The data, released monthly by the US Treasury, confirms this reaction. Between April and December 2024, foreign holdings plummeted by $400 billion in just 8 months. China sold $89 billion. Japan sold $95 billion. Saudi Arabia sold $32 billion. Belgium, often a custodian proxy for Middle Eastern reserves, sold $25 billion. Even the Cayman Islands, a proxy for Chinese institutional money, sold $18 billion. This constitutes the largest sustained foreign selling of US Treasuries in history outside of a major financial crisis. And this is just the beginning. Central banks execute their strategy gradually. They must sell slowly and systematically to avoid crashing the market and devaluing their remaining immense holdings. The selling observed so far is the cautious first wave. The genuine financial tsunami is still gathering force. When foreign central banks were the marginal buyers of treasuries, the US could borrow unlimited amounts at low rates. The Treasury issued new bonds, foreign central banks absorbed them, keeping yields low even as the debt mountain grew exponentially. But when foreign central banks cease buying and begin selling, someone else must step in to absorb the trillion-dollar gap. There are 4 theoretical buyers remaining: domestic institutions, domestic households, foreign private investors, and the Federal Reserve. Domestic institutions, such as pension funds, already hold $6 trillion in treasuries. They cannot dramatically increase their exposure without dangerous concentration risk. Domestic households hold $3 trillion and are not increasing their purchasing volume. Foreign private investors face the same sovereign risk and freezing concerns as the central banks. That leaves only the Federal Reserve. The Fed is structurally supposed to maintain independence from the Treasury and operate monetary policy without financing the government directly. But when literally nobody else will buy the debt, the lifeblood of the US government, the Fed is effectively compelled to step in, or interest yields will spike, triggering an immediate fiscal crisis. This mandatory intervention is known as debt monetization. The central bank prints new money specifically to purchase government bonds. This is the tactic of last resort, employed by failed states like Zimbabwe, Weimar Germany, and Venezuela. It invariably culminates in runaway inflation or devastating currency collapse. And it is already happening. In early 2024, the Fed held $5 trillion in treasuries. By December 2024, this figure had ballooned to $5.2 trillion. The Fed is buying again, despite its official mandate to reduce its balance sheet through quantitative tightening. Why? Because someone has to absorb the selling pressure. Foreign central banks sold $400 billion, domestic buyers did not increase, the Fed absorbed the difference. The Fed's share of the total treasury market increased from 20% in early 2024 to 22% by year-end. That's a 10% proportional increase in ownership in just 8 months. This is the terrifying opening movement of the debt monetization death spiral. Let's examine the specific countries driving this fundamental shift and their motivations. China reduced its treasury holdings from $1.1 trillion in March 2024 to $980 billion by December. That is a $120 billion divestment in 8 months. China is selling for 2 primary reasons. First, they witnessed Russia's fate and understand they are next if tensions escalate over Taiwan. Second, China is actively preparing for a post-dollar world by building its cross-border interbank payment system, CIPS, negotiating oil purchases in yuan, and extending yuan-denominated loans to Belt and Road countries. Japan, a stalwart U.S. ally, reduced holdings from $1.2 trillion to $1 trillion, a $100 billion decline. Japan is not selling out of fear of freezing, but out of necessity driven by its own severe fiscal crisis. Japan needs to finance its own crippling 260% debt-to-GDP ratio. Therefore, Japan is selling highly liquid U.S. assets to fund its own domestic borrowing. This development is deeply significant because Japan has been the most reliable and consistent buyer of US debt for the past 30 years. Saudi Arabia reduced holdings from $135 billion in 2023 to $90 billion by the end of 2024, a 33% reduction in 18 months. Saudi Arabia is also a US ally, but it saw Russia's reserves frozen and asked, could the US freeze ours? The consensus answer is unequivocally yes. If Saudi Arabia cut oil production against US wishes, or if it aligned too closely with China, the US government holds the ultimate leverage, freezing the kingdom's reserves. Saudi Arabia is aggressively diversifying, buying gold, accepting yuan for certain oil sales, and formally joining the BRICS bloc in January 2024. The UAE, Kuwait, and other Gulf states are mirroring Saudi Arabia's strategic lead. Combined, Gulf countries reduced treasury holdings by $80 billion in 2024. The selling is global. It is coordinated not through a conspiracy meeting, but through shared, intense fear. Every central bank saw what happened to Russia and unanimously decided to reduce treasury exposure. What are they buying instead? Gold. Central bank gold purchases in 2024 exceeded 1,000 tons for the third consecutive year, the highest sustained buying spree since the 1970s, right before the collapse of the Bretton Woods gold standard. China officially purchased 225 tons in 2024, unofficial estimates suggest over 400 tons. Turkey bought 80 tons. India bought 75 tons. Poland bought 60 tons. Why gold? Because gold cannot be frozen. Gold held in a country's own subterranean vaults is truly sovereign wealth. Russia's physical gold holdings stored within Russia were never frozen, only its Western reserves were. The lesson learned by every central bank is brutal and clear: repatriate gold and hold it domestically. Other currencies. The yuan's share of global reserves increased from 2.3% in 2022 to 3.2% by 2024. That represents 40% growth in 2 years. While still tiny compared to the dollar's 58% share, the trajectory is unmistakable. Commodities. Some central banks are strategically purchasing physical commodities: oil, copper, rare earths, tangible assets with intrinsic value that cannot be digitally immobilized or frozen by foreign decree. The pattern is stark, rapid, urgent diversification away from treasuries. And the more they diversify, the fewer marginal buyers remain for new US debt issuance. This creates an insurmountable mathematical problem for the US government. The US government currently runs annual deficits of $2 trillion. Total annual borrowing needs, including refinancing maturing debt, amount to $7 trillion, $2 trillion net new debt plus $5 trillion refinancing. Before 2022, foreign buyers reliably purchased 30% of new issuance, roughly $600 billion annually. Domestic buyers purchased 50%, about $1 trillion. The Federal Reserve purchased 20%, about $400 billion. Now, post-April 2024, foreign buyers are selling $400 billion per year instead of buying $600 billion. That's a $1 trillion swing in demand that must be instantly absorbed. Domestic buyers have not increased their capacity, meaning the Federal Reserve must cover the entire $1 trillion gap. The Fed's purchases must increase from $400 billion to $1 trillion annually to absorb both net new issuance and foreign selling. This implies the Fed is now buying approximately 70% of net new Treasury issuance when accounting for the foreign demand deficit. The Fed is becoming the market, and when the central bank is the market has officially failed. This is the creation of a catastrophic death spiral. Fed buying of treasuries necessitates printing new money. Printing money causes inflation. Inflation reduces the real value of treasuries, making foreign holders want to sell more, which forces the Fed to buy more, which prints more money, which causes more inflation, triggering more selling. This is the precise mechanism by which a currency loses its reserve status. Let's project the specific timeline. 2022, February, Russia's $300 billion frozen. The first seed of doubt is planted in every central bank. 2022 to 2023, cautious diversification begins. China and Saudi Arabia start slowly but surely reducing treasury holdings.
2024 April, G7 announces the utilization of Russian asset income. Doubt hardens into absolute certainty. Selling accelerates dramatically. 2024 to 2025, foreign selling intensifies. An outflow of $800 billion to $1 trillion annually is expected. Fed buying escalates rapidly to compensate. 2026 to 2028, breaking point approaches. Foreign holdings fall below $6 trillion. Fed holdings exceed $7 trillion, 30% of all treasuries. Markets begin pricing in severe inflation risk. 10-year yields rise from 4% to 6 to 7% despite massive Fed intervention. 2029 to 2032, crisis becomes visible. Treasury auctions start failing outright. Yields spike uncontrollably to 8 to 10%. U.S. interest payments on the projected $40 trillion debt exceed $3 trillion annually, consuming 60% of all tax revenue. The Fed is forced to dramatically increase monetization efforts. 2033 to 2037, currency crisis. The dollar loses its reserve status for strategic commodities, particularly oil. The dollar's share of global reserves falls below 40%. Inflation accelerates to a sustained 7 to 10% annually. 2037 to 2042, dollar no longer the dominant reserve currency. It remains the largest single currency, but the hegemonic exorbitant privilege is gone. The US must choose between balancing its budget or facing outright hyperinflation. This timeline assumes a relatively gradual decline. It could easily be accelerated by a triggering event, a Taiwan invasion, a major sovereign bank failure, or a political debt ceiling crisis. But even without external shocks, the mathematical endpoint remains the same. When the central bank becomes the primary and sole buyer of government debt, the currency is ultimately doomed. Who wins and who loses in this colossal transition? China wins strategically. China is systematically selling treasuries, buying gold and physical commodities, and aggressively building the CIPS alternative payment system. When the dollar inevitably loses reserve status, the yuan rises by default as the most viable alternative. China is planning for a post-dollar world while the US clings to a rapidly eroding dominance. Gold holders win. As central banks rush to buy gold to replace untrustworthy treasuries, gold prices escalate rapidly. Gold, currently around $4,300 per ounce, could realistically reach $7,000 to $8,000 by 2035 if central banks continue buying 1,000 tons annually for a decade, a guaranteed 200% return. The United States loses hegemony. The ability to borrow unlimited amounts at low rates funds the U.S. military, Social Security, and Medicare, allowing Americans to consume significantly more than they produce. When the Treasury market fails and borrowing becomes prohibitively expensive, all of this becomes unaffordable. The $880 billion military budget is sustainable at 3% borrowing costs, but utterly unsustainable at 8%. American consumers lose purchasing power. Americans import $3.8 trillion and export $3 trillion, maintaining an $800 billion deficit. This imbalance only functions as long as the world unconditionally accepts dollars. When the dollar loses global value, imports become drastically expensive. Gas, electronics, clothing, the prices of all imported goods will rise 30% to 50% over a decade. US Treasury bond holders lose wealth. If yields must rise from 4% to 8% to attract new buyers, existing bonds lose 30 to 40% of their market value. Domestic institutions holding $9 trillion in treasuries face potential losses of $3 trillion. Retirees lose security. As the dollar loses purchasing power through accelerating inflation, Social Security and Medicare benefits decline in real terms. A $2,000 monthly check today might only buy $1,100 worth of goods in 2035. This is the distributed, hidden cost of reserve currency collapse, not one dramatic crash, but a slow, agonizing erosion over 10 to 15 years. Why is this outcome irreversible? The entire mechanism of the Treasury market is predicated on trust. For 8 decades, the world trusted that US Treasuries were the ultimate safe asset, immune to political manipulation. That trust granted the US the privilege of borrowing at preferential rates. But trust, once demonstrably broken by geopolitical actions, is nearly impossible to restore. Russia's reserves were frozen, and then the income was confiscated. Every central bank witnessed this existential violation. They cannot unsee it. Know that U.S. law grants the president sweeping and arguably unchecked authority to freeze the assets of foreign entities or governments under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA. This power is activated by the simple declaration of a national emergency. The invasion of Ukraine clearly met that threshold, qualifying as an emergency. A conflict over Taiwan would unquestionably qualify as a major emergency. But the chilling truth is that virtually any significant geopolitical tension could be unilaterally designated as an emergency, giving the executive branch the power to seize assets. Consequently, this legal framework means that no central bank in the world, regardless of their geopolitical alignment, can truly trust that their dollar-denominated reserves, the supposed bedrock of global financial safety, are actually safe. This fundamental lack of trust forces them into an inevitable strategic move: diversification. The United States theoretically possesses the ability to restore this shattered trust. It could do so by legislatively stripping the president of this unilateral asset freezing authority. However, such a move is practically impossible. Asset freezing is far too valuable and potent a tool, representing the financial equivalent of a nuclear option, essential for modern sanctions warfare. Another theoretical option would be for the U.S. to hold foreign sovereign assets through a demonstrably neutral third party, perhaps the Bank for International Settlements, BIS. But this path requires the U.S. to surrender sovereign control over a significant portion of its financial leverage. The stark reality is this: there is no viable path to restore global trust without surrendering the very weapon that the U.S. insists on wielding. And the U.S. will not surrender the weapon. But the weapon is already engaged in a slow-motion attack on the very structure that gave the United States its singular global power: the deep, liquid, and historically inviolable treasury market. The historical parallel is impossible to ignore. In 1914, at the outbreak of World War I, Great Britain pioneered the weaponization of finance by seizing German assets. Neutral countries, observing this unprecedented move, realized that the British Empire was willing to disregard established financial norms and seize assets purely for political objectives. This realization initiated a slow but irreversible shift. Central banks cautiously began diversifying their reserves away from the British pound sterling. The process was drawn out, spanning decades, but after World War I, New York gradually began replacing London as the global financial hub. By 1944, at the Bretton Woods Conference, the dollar formally usurped the pound as the world's primary reserve currency. Britain's financial dominance, though mortally wounded in 1914, managed to linger for roughly 30 years after the initial act of weaponization. The United States froze Russia's reserves in February 2022. If that historical pattern holds true, the dollar would lose its coveted reserve status around the year 2052. However, the modern era is defined by the acceleration of technology and finance. The slow, analog diversification of the early 20th century, which required months or even years to execute large reserve shifts, has been replaced by instantaneous digital capacity. Central banks can now shift vast sums in hours. We see evidence of this acceleration in the growth of China's cross-border interbank payment system, CIPS, the primary alternative to the US-controlled SWIFT network. CIPS transaction volume exploded from $12 trillion in 2020 to $27 trillion in 2023, effectively doubling its scope in just 3 years. Given this unprecedented speed of financial infrastructure transformation, my estimate for the dollar's dominance collapse is far shorter. The dollar will lose its reserve dominance sometime between 2037 and 2042, roughly 15 to 20 years from the 2022 freeze. This decline means the dollar's share of global reserves, which currently sits near 58%, will likely fall to 35 to 40% by 2040. It may still remain the largest single currency in reserves, but it will be decisively non-hegemonic. The true catalyst, the moment trust shattered irreparably, was not the initial freeze in 2022. It was the decision, formally solidified in April 2024, to move beyond freezing and toward outright usage of the assets.
Specifically, the agreement to confiscate the interest accrued on Russia's frozen $300 billion and transfer that revenue to fund Ukraine. This act crossed the crucial ethical and legal Rubicon, moving the policy from freezing, a defensible act of wartime leverage, to full-scale confiscation and redistribution, an indefensible act of financial theft in the eyes of the global financial community. That single decision irrevocably destroyed the perception of the Treasury market as a safe, neutral store of value. Because once you establish the precedent that reserve assets can be confiscated and repurposed, every nation knows its sovereign reserves are no longer safe. Trust, the invisible scaffolding of the dollar system, is gone. And once trust is gone, the privileged position of the United States is gone. The Treasury market is now in a death spiral. Foreign central banks, desperate to reduce their exposure, are currently selling between $800 billion and $1 trillion worth of US Treasuries annually. Who is compensating for this massive selling pressure? The Federal Reserve. The Fed has been forced into the role of the buyer of last resort, and its share of outstanding government debt is rapidly approaching 30%. When a nation's central bank owns 30% of its own government's debt, that nation is approaching the widely accepted definition of a functionally failed state, dependent entirely on monetary creation to fund itself. The timeline remains 15 to 20 years. By 2037 or 2042, the dollar will no longer be the world's dominant reserve currency. The US Treasury market will no longer be regarded as the safe haven asset of first resort. The United States will lose its historic ability to borrow virtually unlimited amounts at near-zero interest rates. The free lunch America has enjoyed for 80 years is ending. And the trigger was seizing Russia's $300 billion. The cost-benefit analysis is devastatingly clear. The US gained access to $300 billion in frozen assets, or the interest derived from them. In exchange, the US lost the sacred trust that underpins the $7.8 trillion in foreign treasury holdings. That represents a financial loss ratio of approximately 26 to 1. Russia lost $300 billion. America lost the foundation of its financial empire. The silent beneficiary of this catastrophic miscalculation is the People's Republic of China, which has watched, learned, and meticulously prepared its alternative financial infrastructure while the US unilaterally dismantled its own greatest competitive advantage. If this analysis demonstrates to you that the Treasury market is dying, specifically triggered by the April 2024 decision to use the frozen assets, if you understand the gravity of foreign central banks actively selling treasuries right now, forcing the Federal Reserve to become the inflationary buyer of last resort, and if you see this as the undeniable beginning of the dollar reserve status collapse over the next 15 to 20 years, then I urge you to subscribe, because the next video will forecast the devastating consequences when Treasury yields inevitably spike to 8 to 10% and the US government finds it simply cannot afford to service its $40 trillion debt load. The nation will face three horrifying options: outright default on entitlement programs like Social Security and Medicare, hyperinflating the debt away by printing money on a massive scale, or attempting a disruptive restructuring into regionalized currency zones. All three of these outcomes lead to the destruction of the American middle class. The $300 billion they seized from Russia will ultimately cost America an estimated $30 trillion in lost treasury demand and higher borrowing costs over the next 2 decades. That is a brutal 100 to 1 loss ratio. They broke the safe asset. They killed the Treasury market. And in an act of profound self-sabotage, they did it entirely to themselves.